Welcome to the first unit, the beginner introduction to microcontrollers and Arduino. And we're going to start this video off with C++ programming language. So first of all, what is programming? Well, programming is a language. And programs are written in a language, and of these languages there are many different types, such as C++, which we're discussing in this video, C#, Java, HTML, Python, and many more. Just like human languages, there are many variations. Programming languages follow a certain protocol, and this is called the syntax, which could be translated to grammar for code. Then there are many different elements of programming. There are many different data types, and we're all going to discuss these in this video. There are data types, there are different programming environments, also called Integrated Development Environment, IDE for short, functions, if-else statements, and loops. For the C++ syntax, the syntax are the grammar rules. And these grammar rules are for a set of code, it is wrapped in curly brackets. For conditions or variables, for certain functions, these are wrapped in normal brackets. Then to indicate a string of text, which is normal text, you put them in quotation marks. To end the line of code, always use a semicolon. And then preprocessor statements start with a hashtag. This indicates that it's a preprocessor statement and should be done before anything else. One equal sign to bind code to a variable. This is, in this example, it's an integer, a number. So in this case, x equals 5. And two equal signs is when you say if x equals 5, you check if x is actually equal to 5, and then you get an output of a bool, which is a true or false statement. And these different types of words I just mentioned, such as a bool, if statement, will also all be discussed in the next few slides. Then the next thing is code flow. And the code flow is how the compiler reads your code. When you run a program, the code is read line by line from left to right and top to bottom. This is important to know because the computer runs on logic, and if you would, for example, first use a variable and later define it, you would get an error because the compiler or the computer doesn't know what that variable is because you haven't mentioned it before. There are certain expressions that can break the code flow and make the computer read elsewhere, but in this case you will also have to use those carefully and within the same code flow to still make everything flow smoothly. So that isn't really an exception. Then for data types, you have the integer. I already mentioned that beforehand. Integers are numbers, and you can bind a variable with that, such as in the example before, where you say integer x equals 5. Then the string stores text, and you indicate that with with quotation marks. So the boolean is also bool stores a value of true or false, which is the output of an if statement. And true could also be 1 and false could also be 0. So these are also interchangeably used. Instead of true, you could say 1 or false as 0. Then the character, or char for short, is used by one quotation mark, by single quotation marks, and stores only a single character, such as capital A or small a. A float stores decimal numbers, and it uses the same principle as the integer, but then with a decimal number. The void stores no number, and this is not a 0, it's nothing, as in null. Then we are getting to preprocessor statements. Preprocessor statements are defined, as we discussed earlier, by the hashtag. This includes the hashtag and then some certain function or thing you want to recall. And in these examples, it is hashtag include and then some library if you want to use a certain library or database within your code, or hashtag define and then you define some variable. And if you use the hashtag define some variable, this is only applicable if you use multiple sketches or multiple files of code which are not directly connected. So some Arduino specific things. You have the void setup. This is code that only runs once and runs at the beginning of the code. So once you run the code, this thing will be the first thing that runs. Then you also have the void loop. This is code that will be looped once a certain condition is met and only until that certain condition is met. Then in C++ in general, because the thing beforehand was in the Arduino IDE, and in most other IDEs it will look like this, where you have the int main, which is the same as the void setup from before, and this is only code that runs once. And then you have a loop indicated by the while in brackets 1 statement that loops until a certain until it's stopped, and in this case until the condition 1 is true, and in this case 1 equals true, and it will never be stopped. C++ functions. The Arduino has a lot of pre-made functions, but you can also make functions yourself as well. Functions are used to clean up the code and are purely for readability, but if you can't read your code and you won't be able to efficiently edit it, it will be a hassle. So many people put a lot of emphasis on how cleanly your code looks and if it's efficiently put in place. And this is mostly in case that if you need to run a certain piece of code many times, it's very messy to copy the certain line of code you want and paste it down for how many times you want to run it, or how many in many different ways you want to use it. So it's better to just define your code beforehand as a function, in this case void, and then your function name, where you can have certain conditions as an output. So in these brackets you see next to the function name, this indicates what type of output you want, and you can output the integer and a bool. And you can also output a certain string text as seen in the code line below. And if you want to use your function, which you defined beforehand, you put it into the int main, or in other IDEs it will be the void setup, or you can also put it in a loop. And then you mention it with the function name, then your variables, and then return. Then you want to return, which ends the code. If-else statements. On a very basic level, C++ and many other programming languages work like a if-then machine. If some condition is true, then it does this thing that you want it to do. So an if-else statement works like this. If, and then you put in brackets your condition. Let's say you go back to our statement beforehand. If x equals 5, then you run some code. And in case x does not equal 5, then you put this code. And you can also use another if statement after this else statement. So if x does not equal 5, then maybe x is equal to 3. And if that's not true, you can still run other pieces of code. So you can put a long string of if-else statements to make your code like that, even though it's not the most efficient way. And these are all the types of statements you can have, at least in a numerical sense, such as A is less than B, A is bigger or equal to B, A is equal to B, A is not equal to B. And this also works with the bool statements. A is true, A is false. And this will be more problematic to fit that to a string of text. It is definitely possible to put that to a string of text, such as you have your you can type some certain text which changes depending on what you typed, such as your password. And if that's equal to what you said beforehand, what your password was, you can unlock. And if not, you won't be able to unlock your device or other certain types. But if-else statements are mostly used with numerical things. C++ loops. Loops are usually used to repeat a line of code multiple times. There are multiple types of loops, such as this for loop. You see here it says for, and then in brackets integer I. So for every variable I that is equal to 0, do something. C++ loops. There are different types of loops, and loops are usually used to repeat a certain line of code or a certain set of code multiple times. There are different types of loops, such as the for loops. For every this loop, this is for every integer I that is below 10, repeat this certain line of code, and for every time it repeats that, the integer I is increased by 1, indicated by the double plus. And I starts out at equals to 0. So after 10 times, I will be bigger than 10, will be bigger or equal to 10. So this condition is not true. So it will be repeated exactly 10 times for whatever you will have put in between these brackets. Then there are the while loops. The while loops repeat the code only once a certain condition is met. So here in this case, while true or 1, which is true, so while true, run this code. You can also have while x is bigger than whatever, and then you can change that within this piece of code to make x not equal to whatever is in this condition. This while loop will run forever, and you will have to watch out to put a delay in here, otherwise your computer will try to repeat that code as fast as possible, as many times as possible within a small amount of time, which will overheat and overload your computer, which will most likely crash. For further C++ learning, we recommend the C++ tutorial from the Cherno, because what we discussed were the absolute basics of C++, and the YouTube channel, which we will link, and the YouTube playlist is very extensive in discussing the C++ programming language. And here, in our opinion, it goes quite fast, but I like it. And it may not be for everyone, which in case I recommend you to look for a tutorial that will fit you. There are many tutorials out there, so I'm sure you will find one. Then, in the next video, we will be discussing the Arduino IDE in depth and the functions and specialty of it. So, see you then.